Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. This is our last fall session of the Digital Humanities Seminar this year. Next year there will be other ones in the fall and in spring. And my name is Elika Ortega. I'm one of the co-directors together with Phil Simpson, who's the other co-director. And today we are super happy to have Lori Emerson here. I'm going to read the regular introduction, if that's okay. Lori is an associate professor in the Department of English and the Intermediate Arts, Writing and Performance program at the University of Colorado at Boulder. She is the founding director of the Media Archaeology Lab, too. Her research focuses on media poetics as well as the history of computing, media archaeology, media theory, and digital humanities. Lori is currently working on 2 book projects, not 1, but 2. The first is called Other Networks, and is a history of telecommunications networks that existed before or outside of the internet. And the second one is called The Lab Book, Situated Practices in Media Studies, and is co-written by Josie Barica and Darren Worsler and herself. She is the author of Reading Writing Interfaces from the Digital to the Book Bound, published by the University of Minnesota last year, and the co-editor of 3 collections, The Johns Hopkins Guide to Digital Media, with Mary Lou Ryan and Benjamin Robertson, also from 2014, and Writing Surfaces, the selected fiction of John Rideau with Derek Bouliot from 2013, and The Alphabet Game, a BP Nicole Reader with Darren Worsler as well, published in 2007. Why don't you just let you go ahead? All right. Thank you, Lori. It's great to have you here.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming out today to hear me talk. And I wanted to especially thank Elika and Phil and Brian for bringing me here. It's really nice to be here. I also should apologize for the title change. My time is now this title. But I will be touching on how the internet is an unfinished demo at some point. I just wanted something a little bit more expansive to let me talk about the different projects I'm working on. So here's the overview of things we're going to talk about. I'm going to first start with an overview of the Media Archaeology Lab and why I created it in 2009 and what it's turned into since then. And I also wanted to show you how the lab and my personal research and writing are different sides of the same coin and how they also come out of my work in the lab. I think if I had to come up with an overarching argument for what I'm talking about today, it's about the value of practice-based research, or as I put it in my title, tinkering and open-ended play as something that drives thinking. This is it's a position that's acceptable in arts and humanities departments in North America to the extent that it attracts funding, but it's still not acceptable when it comes to tenure and promotion. So I've found that this work is fine as long as you continue to teach teach your courses and also write books and articles. So it's it's a paradoxical position. So let me start with the Media Archaeology Lab. I've been obsessed for probably the last 6 or 7 years with trying to understand the inner workings of obsolete computers, and this is an obsession that's caught me by surprise and certainly has caught the English department by surprise because they did not hire somebody who likes to tinker with old computers. They hired somebody who has an interest in digital poetry. But in retrospect, I think this actually all makes sense, and it actually points to how literary studies could be rejuvenated if it wanted to be, and the way in which it could move beyond the close reading of whatever is conventionally seen as a literary text. So my educational background is in experimental poetry and poetics, and I actually picked this field because of my interest in materiality, whether it's sound poetry in the material presence of the body, or a concrete poetry in the material shape, size, and texture of individual letters created with writing technologies, whether letterpress, typewriter, or dry transfer lettering, or whatever. So there was a natural move then from this into researching digital poetry as another form of experimental writing, and then I began thinking about the nature of materiality in digital poetry and e-literature more broadly. So I think this is 2008, 2009, along with a couple colleagues, in North America who were working with things that resembled labs. They may not have actually been calling them labs at that point. We started to want to think more about how the original platforms for early works of e-literature from the early 1980s to the early 1990s were essential to the works themselves, so for two basic reasons. At that time, you really needed to have the original platforms just to provide access to and preserve these early works of digital literature and art, especially in cases where no one had created an emulation yet. Emulations were quite rare, actually, in 2008, 2009, and in terms of digital literature, I think they are still quite rare for some reason. The other reason that I was interested in working with the original platforms themselves is that I was interested in thinking about how the platforms are part and parcel of the works themselves and how it gives you insight into how they're produced and insight into how to understand these works. So back in 2009, my solution to this need for preservation and access in e-literature was to create the Media Archaeology Lab. At that time, I called it the Archaeological Media Lab, not knowing that there was such a thing as media archaeology. And at first, the lab had only 15 Apple IIe computers, and this is a glamour shot of one of our computers. I should mention that nearly everything the lab has accomplished has happened because of a lot of volunteer work and donations. So this lovely picture happened because of an undergraduate student who dragged her mom into the lab, who's a professional photographer, and she took a lot of great pictures of computers in the lab. So the lab originally had 15 Apple IIe computers so that students in my classes as well as researchers could run the original version of B.P. Nichols' first screening that he wrote 1982 to 1983 in Apple Basic on an Apple IIe computer. And we're very fortunate to have what you might call manuscript versions of this early work. It's a work of kinetic digital poetry. So we have them on 5¼ inch floppy. This is an emulated version of the work that came out, I think it was actually the same year I started at the lab, and I'll just let that run in the background. So the lab began just with Apple IIe computers, and my thought was that I would have, 15 undergraduate students come into this tiny little room, and all of them would work on the computers and run B.P. Nichols' first screening. And that was sort of the beginning of the end, because then I wanted to try to explore the other comparable computer, popular computer of the era, which was the Commodore 64. And once you go down that road, there's really no coming back. So then, that just opened up the door to actually just receiving a lot of incredible donations, mostly from people that I met on eBay and became friends with, and they would start sending me really incredible machines that I didn't know anything about, like the Vectrex. Hopefully I have a picture of that up. So I tried to sell the lab during those early years as an entity for supporting a locavore approach to sustaining digital literature. This was my way of sort of justifying its very modest presence online in a tiny space. And just as a side note, I'm starting to return to that idea as I'm realizing, probably somewhat unpopularly, that the Media Archaeology Lab is actually not for everybody, and that I'm actually pretty happy with that. I've had to come to some difficult realizations about what the lab can do and what I want it to do with interactions with tech companies and startup companies, and finding these interactions being pretty unsatisfying. I'll just leave it at that. I mean, you can ask me more questions about that in the Q&A. Interestingly enough, the lab moved into a larger space in 2012 because the department secretaries thought the lab was really amazing, and so they actually orchestrated this complicated space exchange. So it happened through people working in administrative positions in the department and not faculty positions. And ever since then, the lab has really really exploded into this really open-ended, flexible entity. And I want to emphasize, too, before I get into specifics of the lab, that its open-endedness and the fact that I had no one to report to, and the fact that there was a lack of a hierarchical structure really made the lab into what it is now, and also into what it continues to be. The fact that it mostly flies under the radar in the university is the very thing that allows it to thrive, I think. And I've also come to see that having artists as well as humanists involved in the ongoing process of creating and building the lab is a great way to intervene in the science-dominated culture of labs. Labs that are very often, not always, but very often, tightly controlled spaces that are closed to people that are not directly affiliated with that particular research group. And these labs are also generally quite procedurally rigid, as well as hierarchical. So I've been doing a lot of research lately into science labs and the way they operate, and also trying to figure out why there's a sudden explosion of labs in the arts and humanities, especially in the last 5 years, that came shortly after I started up the Media Archaeology Lab. And especially in digital humanities, it seems that there is really a strong move toward, I think, pre-legitimizing the work that people are doing in the humanities and the digital humanities. And the way they're pre-legitimizing that is by sort of appropriating the veneer of, I don't know, scientificity. It's not actually a word, but it should be. So I have no interest in taking on lab as a way to emulate the sciences in this regard. And I'm also not interested in giving our lab the veneer of scientific work as a way to legitimize what we're doing. I'm intentionally trying to create a porous, flexible creative space for, again, doing, thinking, playing, creating as an instigator for rigorous thinking in whatever register people would like. So now to get into the specifics. There are probably thousands of individual items in the Media Archaeology Lab. The lab consists of 3 kind of weirdly shaped rooms because we're in the basement of a house that's from the 1920s and the 1930s. And our strongest collection is, that's not me, right? Somehow, magically.
It's no way so.
Okay. Our strongest collection is the history of personal computers. But not surprisingly, the lines have become very blurry about what we collect and what we don't collect. And as long as we continue to have room, I'm interested in just about any old media items that come along. So we have this fantastic early, maybe you could call this a personal computer from 1976 called the Altair 8800B. Has anyone seen one of these before? Oh, you have. I need you to come to the lab and teach me how to use it. I think this is wonderfully baffling. So you know more about this than I do, but this is an 8-bit machine. Up is 1 and down is 0, am I right? This one was apparently a fancy version because it has output with the red flashing LED lights. So I love bringing my students in the lab and inviting them to imagine how computing could be different or otherwise if it had just been shrunk down to these little boxes that we carry around in our pockets without any screen-based way to interact with them. What else? This is the best picture I could come up with for a collection of Apple desktop computers. You can see the Apple IIe computers on the left there. Right beside it is an Apple Lisa machine. Some of you may be familiar with it. This was the first sort of mainstream computer that had a graphical user interface, and sold in 1983 for $10,000, which is something like $21,000 or $22,000 in 2015. And then all the other Apple computers. Not because I'm not actually a giant fan of Apple, but they've had such a profound influence over design and the shape of computing that that's why they're in the lab. And the non-Apple desktop computers, including the Next Cube, there on the right. So we have on display computers that are importantly still functioning. Everything that's on display, everything that's in the lab works and is meant to be turned on and played with and tinkered with and experimented with. We have both popular mainstream computers as well as oddities. And this is one of the oddities. This is a Canon Cat computer. I think it was produced only for 6 months, 1986, 1987. It was designed by Jeff Raskin after he left the Apple Macintosh team. And the interface is nothing that you've ever seen before. It is text-based, but not command line. The interface is more built directly into the keyboard. It's hard to see in this picture, but the commands are built directly into the keyboard. It's a very strange machine, and he called it an advanced work processor. So, yeah. We have lots of game consoles, of course. I would have to, even though I'm not a gamer, it's obviously very important to the history of computing. And we have a really nice, large collection of portable, luggable, and laptop computers. My favorite one is the one on the far left there. That's an Osborne 1 computer from 1981. And the most famous user of this model of machine is Ralph Ellison, who wrote his last novel, Juneteenth, on an Osborne 1 computer. And you can start to see why Juneteenth turned out the way it did when you use this computer and try to load up WordStar. For one thing, the screen is no exaggeration about that big, and the font size is maybe 5 or 6, and it really forces your body to the most contorted position so that you can see what's going on the screen, and you can really only see about that much text at one time. But I also use this machine when I'm teaching units on software studies. I don't know if anyone here has ever read Matthew Fuller's fantastic essay on Microsoft Word. Looks like you're writing a letter. It's a great critique of Microsoft Word and how it's become utterly naturalized. And my 18, 19, 20-year-old students have a hard time imagining a world that could exist outside of Microsoft Word. And so I bring them in and have them use WordStar, not as something that's less than, but as something that's utterly different, and try to get them to imagine how word processing could be, I don't know, possibly better if they used different software. Typewriters, word processors. And this is where I get back to how I have a hard time drawing a line in the sand about what we collect and what we don't collect. We also have lots of analog media from the early 20th century. We have delineoscopes, we have projectors, we have a magic lantern from, I think, 1907, 1908. And we recently acquired an Edison diamond disc photograph that I found in a local furniture store for $175. That's from 1912. And let's see if I can, there it is. Oh yeah, I'm gonna have to get back to that in a minute, actually. Okay. So, in the lab, things you can do. You can do practice-based research in any number of ways. This is what I'm calling it, sort of practice-based research as an extension of media archaeology, actually. You can do hands-on teaching. I have students come in the lab who are from film, from art and art history, from media studies, journalism, computer science. There's a lot of fields that the lab interacts with or intersects with. Can also use it to train students on how to accession and catalog. And we've also collaborated with students on coming up with an appropriate metadata scheme to describe our collections, because we weren't able to find one that actually worked properly, so we just invented our own. Can also use the lab to train people in disk imaging, which I guess gets to this. So we're working with the digital archivist that's in special collections and teaching people and learning ourselves about how to image some of the software and digital art literature that we have in the lab. And also, maybe more importantly, we've we've used the lab to host artists' residencies. We had a postdoc, her name was Mel Hogan, who came to the lab a couple years ago, and she started up an artist residency series as a way to really try to get people to actively start using the machines that are in the lab. There's something about walking to the lab and seeing the machines lined up, especially if they're not on, that really leads people to treat the lab as a museum. And the lab is really not a museum. It's, if anything, it's an anti-museum museum. And so having artist residencies has been a great way to intervene in this. So I think I've got some images from artist residencies. This one was put together by Aaron Angelo and Aaron Costello. And it's, they created a work of digital literature that's distributed across a whole bunch of machines in the lab, and also have a projector going on top and QR codes. It was really pretty amazing. This is a piece made by Joel Swanson. I guess this was more inspired by the lab than anything, where he's interested in gestures that have been created out of interface design. He also created this beautiful delete keys from the machines that are in the lab. And this is by Matt Soar, who's a professor and artist of communication at Concordia University, who did a study of the different colors of the machines in the lab. Okay. This slide, I apologize, is probably not in the right place, but what I wanted to demonstrate with these slides is the way in which the lab is really useful for experimenting with time and with history, I suppose. So again, I'm not interested in using the lab to reinscribe conventional historical stories of how things came to be. Instead, I'm really interested in actually putting old tech up next to new tech and seeing what that friction results in. And you would think that there's no place for a photograph player in the lab with all these machines, but actually it makes perfect sense, especially when you start to realize that Edison maybe is not the founding father of proprietary tech, but he's definitely one of the first people to really start to use this approach in marketing and manufacturing his discs. So when we got the Edison Diamond Disc Player, it came with 2 drawerfuls of discs, and each disc comes with a huge warning label that states very explicitly that you can only use these discs with an Edison photograph player. If you dare, I mean, the implied message is if you dare try to play this on a Victrola, you will destroy your machine and the disc. So I thought this was really fascinating. I like to have a photograph player in the lab right next to all of the Apple machines, because it just seems appropriate. Okay. So this is, I just came up with this chart as I've been thinking more and more about where the MAL stands in relation to particularly science labs, but also I would just say labs in general. And I think the MAL is unique for a number of reasons. First of all, rather than being hierarchical and classificatory both in its display and organization of objects as well as people, it's porous, flat, and branching. So objects are organized in any way that participants want. Everything is functional and made to be turned on. Also, rather than setting it to adhere to specific outcomes and 5-year plans, we change from semester to semester and year to year, depending on who's spending time in the lab and who shows up at our front door. Rather than being an entity you need to apply to be a part of something, you can only participate in if you're you have a formal title as a researcher, librarian, or a PhD student. Anyone can participate in the lab and have a say about what projects we take on and what kind of work we do. Also, rather than being about the display of precious objects, whereby you only ever get a sense of the external appearance or even the external functionality of the objects, we encourage people to tinker, to play, to open things up, and even to disassemble. rather than the perpetuation of neat historical narratives about how things came to be, we instead encourage a more experimental approach to time. So again, putting the Edison disk beside contemporary proprietary software, or we might put our Vectrex gaming console that comes with a beautiful light pens from 1983, 1984. Put that up next to a tablet and a stylus that's from the 21st century. And finally, rather than participating in the process of erasing the knowledge production process or helping to perpetuate the illusion of a separation between those who work in the lab and the machines they work on, and hiding the agency of the machines themselves as well as the agency of the larger infrastructure of the lab, we are interested in constantly situating everything and anything we do in the lab and being self-conscious and very descriptive about the minute particularities of the production process for any projects that we undertake. So in this way, it's my hope that the MAL can be a tool for moving away from humanism. This is the main thread that I've seen, even in science labs, this attempt to erase the process, to erase the knowledge production process, and to try to maintain the illusion that there is some sort of separation between humans and the machines that they're using. Instead, we're really about making that obvious, I suppose, in a way that moves away from a celebration of the human. So it's equally about a celebration of objects and machines. And in this way, tentatively, provisionally, using the MAL to model what post-humanities might look like. So this last chart here and what I just finished touching on form the basis of my contributions to a book project I'm working on right now with Yussi Parika, who's in London, and my colleague Darren Werschler, who's in Montreal at Concordia. And we're working on a book called The Lab Book, Situated Practices in Media Studies. And what we're trying to do is chart, I guess loosely, the history of arts and humanities labs through the 20th century and try to figure out why there's been such an explosion of labs in the last 5 years. So presenting, we're trying to come up with a critical, historical, and also very much international examination of labs and how they reflect shifts going on in higher education as well as the information technology sector. So I'm happy to answer more questions about that in Q&A, but for now I'll just set that aside. So for the rest of my talk, what I'd like to do is touch on two of my projects, reading, writing interfaces, and also my current project, Other Networks, as a way to show you how I've used the lab to generate these more conventional book projects. As I've already mentioned, my career still depends on me writing articles and writing books, so this is part of that venture. As Elika very kindly mentioned, reading, writing interfaces came out in spring 2014, I think it was. And it really was a product of the Media Archaeology Lab. In hindsight, I think it's odd that I didn't talk more about the Media Archaeology Lab in my book. I think I probably was still coming to terms with the way in which lab-based practice could be used to generate something like a book. But what I was trying to do in reading, writing interfaces is mesh together media archaeology, media studies, and literary studies in a way that I hadn't seen been done very much. And I was also trying to do a reverse chronology, starting with the present moment and working my way back all the way to Emily Dickinson, as a way to dig back through archaeological layers, descending back and in time to look at how personal computing could have been otherwise and still could be otherwise, looking specifically at interface design. I was also trying to use media archaeology and this reverse chronology, not just to give lip service to how we're all against narratives of technological progress, but to actually uncover examples of earlier interfaces and earlier modes of computing that could do some things better than what we're able to do today. At the same time, I was using writers to try to show how writers have a unique ability to register the affordances of other and older modes of computing by working with and against interfaces. So I started from the present moment and looked at work by Jason Nelson and his weird, intentionally ugly, scrawly, messy digital game poems that are intentionally trying to subvert the clean aesthetic of the web and the clean interface of the web. And then moved back to 1960s, 1970s dirty concrete poetry that was being made, especially a lot of it was being produced in Toronto. These poets were very much under the influence of Marshall McLuhan and actually vice versa as well. And they were basically trying to register the media noise of the typewriter. And then moving farther back, looking at Emily Dickinson and looking at the way in which, sorry, I don't know why that word text is sitting right there. That's text.
Intervention.
What's that?
Intervention.
Yes, that's right. But, what's that?
It's a glitch.
It's a glitch. That's right, I'm registering the agency of the machine. Looking at how she was experimenting with the interface that we take for granted. Similarly to the same way that Microsoft Word has become utterly naturalized as an interface, so too has, I think, pen and pencil and paper. And Emily Dickinson was really acutely aware of the affordances of that particular interface. So in this context, I've been working more and more on developing theories of what I'm calling media poetics. So these are all examples of media poetics. So I'm interested in looking at the ways in which writers are not just registering through writing the affordance of whatever writing technology is at hand. They are doing that, but they're also performing studies of media to disrupt the ways in which corporations now work to very often make these affordances invisible and then celebrate that invisibility in terms of the wonders of seamlessness, intuitiveness, transparency, user-friendliness, and so on, all these lovely catchwords. Media poetics has become for me a really powerful argument for the value of literature, not as something that expresses who we are, whatever that is, and not as something that necessarily tells stories about who we are, although it could do that, and sometimes it does that very powerfully, but as something that registers media effects. And I think this is another place where the posthumanities comes in. So more than just everyday uses of media, whether they're made with pen and paper, typewriter, personal computer, or on a network, these works of media poetics are limit cases of the capabilities of specific media. They're expressions of machines themselves, just as much as they're expressions of their human authors. So in turn, I think this makes possible reading e-literature, digital literature, less for what it says and more for how it says and how it's reading its own writing process. And I think this also means, in this context, replacing close reading with descriptions of media effects as an alternative mode of reading. And I think it actually takes reading off the spectrum of close and distant reading altogether and just reorients the object of what's being read in very different terms. Okay, so that's reading-writing interfaces. The project that I've been working on since reading-writing interfaces came out is called Other Networks. And this project began as a result of a very innocent question that Matthew Kirschenbaum asked me at an MLA conference a couple years ago. He asked me about the 90s in my book and why I didn't talk about the 90s. And this made me realize that writers and artists weren't so much working with or against the material constraints of hardware in the 90s, but I think they were working with or against networks, with the newly inaugurated World Wide Web, as well as the other thousands of other kinds of networks that existed at that time, like BBSs, slow scan TVs, and the list actually goes on for a very long time. The Other Networks project also comes out of experiments that I was doing in the Mal to get a phone line set up and then try surfing the web. It was just sort of an off-the-cuff experiment that I just thought I'd try. And then we tried to surf the web, first using a version of Netscape from 1997, 98. Then we tried surfing the web with WebStalker. I don't know if anyone here has ever heard of that. Yeah, WebStalker is this fantastic piece of, I guess, art software from the late 90s that Matthew Fuller and a bunch of other people made. It's not really about usability so much as it's about experimentation. And this comes out of a very different era of computing, when there was such a thing as browser days. It was taking place in Europe, where competitions to invite people to come up with different ways to access the web and come up with a different kind of browser. And we were also trying to access the web with Mosaic, because Alan Liu very generously gave us 3.5-inch floppies to install Mosaic. All of these experiments, to the extent that they succeeded, which is to say barely, they offered us completely different experiences of being online and utterly different kinds of access to information that nowadays is brought to us through the utterly naturalized interface of Google. But the experiments also, I can talk more about this in Q&A, also made me realize the limits of the Mal. Because we had the machines, we had the software, but we still weren't able to really fully get online because the university servers basically would not recognize, I don't know exactly what it wasn't recognizing, but it was an insurmountable problem, unless I wanted to start collecting servers, which I don't really want to do. Okay, so my project, Other Networks, is basically a network archaeology. It takes all these things that I've just been talking about, mainly to do with software and hardware, and transfers it to the realm of networks. Moving from the present to about the mid-1960s, Other Networks covers the odd history of telecommunications networks that predate the internet or that exist outside of the internet. And these were, incidentally, networks that were imagined, planned, and created right alongside the tumultuous history of user-friendly interfaces and personal computing. So what I'm interested in doing is trying to imagine how the internet, or how networks in general, were otherwise, could have been otherwise, and still could be otherwise. And doing this through two extensions of the same project. One is a catalog that again moves from the present back through the 1960s, looking at how these networks worked and for whom did they work, and at the same time looking at art and literature created on these networks. I think that's a crucial piece of the puzzle. And then the second part is an academic monograph that builds on the catalog. So what I'd like to do for the rest of my talk is just try to talk very quickly about 3 specific networks that have caught my eye, some of which I have set up in the Media Archaeology Lab. So again, since the project is moving from present to the past, one of the first networks that will probably appear in the catalog is Occupy.here. And this was created in 2012 in parallel with the Occupy movement. Occupy.here claims that it exists entirely outside of the internet, although I suspect they actually mean outside of the World Wide Web, but I'm not completely sure. And so they describe themselves, or they describe the network as inherently resistant to surveillance. So Occupy.here consists of a Wi-Fi router near Zuccotti Park in New York City, and I think it's still alive and running. And anyone with a smartphone or a laptop within range of it can access it through a portal website that then opens up onto what the creators describe as a bulletin board style message board in which users can share messages and files. Occupy.here is also an example of a darknet. Darknet is a network that uses non-standard protocols, that anonymizes users, and generally creates connections only between trusted users. Not surprisingly, darknets have been looked at with a lot of suspicion since at least the 1970s. And I think the term came from ARPA, and ARPA used it to describe any networks that were unavailable via ARPANET, and these were called darknets. And then there was a fresh wave of concern, I'm sure throughout the 80s, but it came up once more in the early 2000s when a group of Microsoft researchers published a paper called The Darknet and the Future of Content. And there they argued that the darknet was the greatest stumbling block to their ability to control the use of digital content and devices after they've been sold to consumers. I thought that was interesting, especially the way the darknet's been completely vilified as this area of, evil and crime. Yeah, when it's really probably about people's inability to make more money. So you can see why the Occupy movement would be so attracted to darknets as a means to circumvent not just surveillance, but also the entire economic underpinning of the internet. So as readers dig through the layers of networks that I cover in my catalog, they'll hopefully start to notice the way the reverse chronology actually starts to turn up distinctly nonlinear or maybe even recursive history of networks, where these networks emerge, disappear, and then they re-emerge again, slightly recalibrated. So I just mentioned that Occupy.here calls itself a bulletin board system, which is a kind of network that emerged in the late 1970s. While nearly all histories of the internet will generally assert that BBSs died out with the introduction of the World Wide Web in the early 90s, Occupy.here is a small but very effective disruption to this narrative. And incredibly, while there are lots of self-published first-person accounts of BBSs and plenty of enthusiasts online that like to reminisce about their years running or participating in BBSs, no media studies book has yet been written on probably the most important telecommunications network of the 80s and the 90s. And then suddenly the rest of my PDF is not here. Sorry, Lauren, let me just try to go into Dropbox and see if that helps. No, okay, I got it. Thank you. Sorry. I've already mentioned too that the Media Archaeology Lab has a phone line installed. We have a network administrator who's a great fan of the lab, and he's managed to set up this phone line. And so we're in the process of setting up our own BBS that people can call into if they want. This may be another unsuccessful experiment, and we might end up talking to ourselves. But I do think that it's crucial to try to have some sort of a tangible example of what it's like to handle this, to interact with this network, to try to really understand it. But to try to give you a little bit more historical context for BBSs, the first BBS was called a computerized bulletin board system, and it was created in 1978. And just looking at this picture, you can start to get a sense of some of the hurdles I'm going to have to overcome in this project, which is the absence of an archive. This is the best visualization I've been able to come up with for the CBBS, which is just the founder sitting there beside his machine. It's really an uninspiring picture. Hopefully something else will come up. And it was originally conceived of just as a computerized version of an analog bulletin board for exchanging information. Each BBS had a dedicated phone number, which generally meant that only one person could dial in at a time. This also meant that generally BBSs were communities of local users, because at that time long-distance phone charges were prohibitively expensive, which created the unusual situation of having a technology that brought local users together and then encouraged them to get together in real life. Of course, there were lots of different things that people did with BBSs, but one of them was to distribute ASCII art in ANSI art. I know there are better examples of these images I'm showing you. That's yet another challenge. But one BBS in particular that I'm really interested in is called, or was called, The Thing, that was most active between 1991 and 1995. This is a BBS that New York artist Wolfgang Stahle started just 1 month after Tim Berners-Lee launched the World Wide Web. He imagined The Thing as an online community center for artists and writers, also as a virtual exhibition space, and later he imagined it as a node and a network of international The Thing BBSs. So there was one in Cologne and a couple more in Europe. But what really interests me about The Thing, a few more funny images. The thing that's really fascinating about The Thing is the way in which the network was conceived of as an artwork itself, much more than any individual piece of art that was being distributed online. This is a great quote from Wolfgang. And wonderfully and problematically, the MAL has the hardware for The Thing BBS. Everything works fine. There are files on those machines, but unfortunately, Wolfgang cannot remember the username and the password for the computers. And incredibly, we haven't been able to break into them. I would have thought it'd be really easy to do, but it's turned out to not be the case. So this is what it looks like until you get to the username and password screen. It's also been really exciting for me to discover not only that a majority of pre-internet writer and artist networks were Canadian, because I'm Canadian, but also that these networks were some of the most vibrant and influential. And I think this is important because it helps work against the inaccurate US-centric story of the invention of the internet. There's lots of other networks that you can use to counter the story that aren't just Canadian. But there were an inordinate number of Canadian networks, and I think that's primarily because of government policy. In 1983, someone named Tom Sherman, who was working as an officer for the Canada Council for the Arts, he launched the Media Arts section of the Canada Council for the Arts, and then developed a program called Integrated Media, which was Canada's first funding program for digital media arts. And I think it's very un-American because the program explicitly supported work that used new or unusual combinations of media and which had failed in the past to find support. I thought that was really interesting. Here's a little quote from Sherman. He said this a few months after launching the program. He says, "It's always important for public money to be used in a way which either opposes or misuses utilities to a certain degree, just to show that there's some potential for different types of uses for those systems." So one of these systems supported by the Canada Council was called Artex, originally called Artbox. And incredibly, this network lasted for 11 years. So it was started in 1980, lasted until 1991. And it was just a very simple and cheap electronic mail program designed to be used by artists and writers interested in what they were calling then alternative uses of advanced technology. The program and the network were provided by IP Sharp Associates time-sharing network that was based in Toronto and then in Victoria. And I do have one example of a writerly use of the network. The piece that was created on the network was by Norman White, and it was called Hearsay. It's from 1985, and it was a tribute to the Canadian poet Robert Zend. I'm trying to see if I have an image. I do not. If you're curious, Robert Zend is most well known for creating really astonishingly beautiful typewriter landscapes, or typewriter poems, I suppose. The book is called Arbor Mundi, and there's a PDF of it on my website if anyone is interested. But Hearsay by Norman White builds on this text that Robert Zend wrote in 1975, and I'm just going to leave it up there and let you read it. Norman White takes this text and transforms it into an event, which I think is really interesting because, of course, an event is probably the most appropriate way to take advantage of a digital network rather than something that's a static text. So it was in a Hearsay. The piece by Norman White was an event based on the children's game of telephone, where you whisper a message from one person to the next and it arrives back at its origin, usually totally garbled. So what White did was he sent Zend's text around the world in 24 hours on the IP-sharp time-sharing network, roughly following the sun. And there were 8 participating centers, and each one was charged with translating the message before sending it on to the next participating center. And then it arrived back in Toronto 24 hours later as this. I think this is a great example of why close reading is not an appropriate way to analyze this text. I think it's much more about seeing the way in which this text registers the noise of the network itself and also the noise of the participating people. Okay. Well, I think those are basically the networks that I wanted to go over. I think the point of other networks is going to be largely to look at how the history of the internet, how it came to be, is much more muddied and contradictory and strange than has yet been accounted for. And also, just to circle back to the beginning of my talk, I wanted to note, as a way of wrapping up, that the lab itself and the underlying philosophy of the lab is really what's driving this project, just like it drove reading, writing interfaces. These are all ideas about ruptures, about interfering in narratives of technological progress, about the tight connection between the materiality of a machine and what's created on or with that machine. And these are all ideas that really come into focus when you have hands-on direct access with machines. And I expect that I'm going to rely, once again, very heavily on the lab to do research for this project as I try to get these networks up and running in the lab and using the original machines and the original software. Okay, well, that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for listening to me.
And we have time for questions. Please.
So you're preserving these physical objects for now, and you mentioned emulators.
Yeah.
Over the long term, how long is your Altair going to be able to be functional?
Not very long. Yeah.
And I was browsing as you were talking, and I noticed that someone has actually produced a front panel that you can use with an emulator on the back end, so you get the physical experience of using the front panel of the Altair.
Oh, that's cool.
With the attach it to a Raspberry Pi or something.
Pardon me?
Attach it to a modern.
Right, to an emulator, which I think that I even read a month or so ago that somebody has a website now that emulates Altair and
Yes, I think I've seen that.
Trash 80 and so on.
Yeah, I think I've really come to, well, I think the last time I saw Altair in Mexico City, which was what, is it 2 years ago?
A year ago.
A year ago. Then I think I was saying, yes, the lab isn't going to last maybe even another 10 or 15 years because the machines themselves are not going to last that long. And now I think I've even taken a step further in that I think the lab shouldn't last for too long, actually. Just philosophically, I think it's probably not healthy to try to keep something alive in an institutional context for that long. on the other hand, as I said, it kind of breaks my heart a little bit because nonetheless, they're precious to me, and a lot of them are precious to other people.
Yeah.
And the best donations in the lab come from people that have given them to me, that they had an important role in their personal lives and sat in their living rooms and their kitchens, and they had their whole families use these machines. So
You should connect with Earl Schweppe here, and he's a computer science professor.
Oh, yeah.
Who apparently has a museum in his basement. He even has a piece of ENIAC, I think.
Oh, wow.
One of the first computers.
Wow, that would be great.
Yeah. And I had a lot of thoughts. I don't want to monopolize here, but you mentioned early browsers. Right across the street here, Lynx was written. I don't know if you know what Lynx was.
No.
It was a non-graphical browser. It was the most popular browser on the initial World Wide Web.
Oh, wow.
And people in our computing center wrote that.
Oh, that's great.
And at one point it was the browser.
Wow.
And then the Netscape people produced a visual browser.
Yeah.
But probably still available.
We've evolved from links with the Y, like the cat, to LINKS.
Yeah.
Still exists in the Linux world.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you could
Maybe I'll have to come back.
browse without graphics.
Right.
But probably anymore, I mean, everything is
It
JavaScript.
does better than Mosaic does, honestly. I mean, at
That's
this point.
interesting. I wonder if there's archives for that here. This is part of the problem, is that it's such recent history and things happen so quickly. I wonder if there are even archival materials for any of these things.
People are not thinking about preserving these things as, as the next thing comes along.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then you mentioned early bulletin board systems. One that I think, again, I was browsing, started in '85 was the Well. Have you ever heard of
Oh,
the
yeah.
Well?
Yes, I have.
Yeah.
I think that's the thing that really got me excited about this project, was reading about the well.
And I think it's still going.
It is.
Yeah.
You have to pay,
Yeah.
but it's not very much.
Mhm.
Yeah.
It's part of the.
You always had to pay.
What's
Related-
that?
On the well, you always had
You
to pay.
did?
Yeah,
Hmm.
that was, a lot of old BBSs actually were like the
You
more
paid.
commercial ones especially.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could just talk a little more about the kind of materiality angle, because it strikes me, given the last question about emulation, and the idea that things might not last for a very long time. I don't know, it seems like there's a sort of tension there between, on the one hand, the idea that, looking at these technologies archaeologically can kind of open up paths that were not the ones that were eventually taken. But at the same time, and I was thinking about this as well when you're talking about BBSs, like I know people who run BBSs on the internet, and there's also confusion, right? Like web boards are a certain kind of bulletin board, but I know people who run like 80s, 90s style BBSs on the internet, because it's just a serial connection, and you can use Telnet as easily as you can use like a COM port on an old computer. So I guess what I'm getting at with emulation and sort of running BBSs on the internet and things like that, isn't there a sense in which the present kind of incorporates all of these old moments anyway, even if they weren't the paths that were taken? And how does sort of materiality, or the idea that maybe it's not that necessary to have the actual machines play into that?
Yeah, I think I completely agree with you, and maybe what I'm interested in doing is showing exactly how that has come to be, but not in a linear, let me
Okay.
show you this neat history, but to precisely open up, maybe more metaphorically, the archaeological layers of how things are currently, and how, yes, there are BBSs online today, and where did they come from, and what's their role, and why have they been so totally occluded from histories of the internet, aside from people that know them very well and participated, which I think are probably a minority of internet users. Yeah.
Having programmed in Altair, just the physical difficulty of flipping the switches and so on, I think would make it a very different experience to click on bits on the screen with a mouse.
Oh yeah, it's a muscle memory. I've seen people like yourself come into the lab who have a body memory of octal and can do crazy things with switches that
Yeah.
I can't do.
Of course, the corpus of the box of cards. Go back to the punch cards. I mean,
Yeah.
Sorry, what did you say?
I was saying, well, or the physicality of, having the box of punch cards and, hey, drop them.
Pressing
And,
the key and hearing
Yeah.
a big loud bang as the
Yeah,
hole is punched in the card.
absolutely, yeah.
Uh,
I think that's why my students get really excited coming to the lab. Who would have guessed that it seems like the ideal demographic for the lab is 18 to 22, but that seems to be it. And I think it's precisely because there's a real tangibility to those machines that they don't have anymore. I mean, they put the floppy in the Apple IIe computer and you can actually hear the disk whirring and crunching and yeah.
Typing on a selectric versus typing on an current Apple keyboard.
Oh, yeah.
There's no play and that
Yeah.
clunk of the,
it's the reactions between, the people that remember it as adults and people that, hey, this is kind of new because it's old, and then the people like me that, I grew up as like 3 years old and we had the TI-99.
Yeah.
That was my life right through the middle of it. So, there's the nostalgia, but it's very real.
I don't.
Also, the kids that it's
But
not
it's,
mentally the same.
yeah, it's weird. I've used the word nostalgia too when I watch the students come in the lab, but what are they nostalgic for? Because it's not a past they lived through because
Right.
they're too young.
A lot of the, Windows 95 is all they ever do,
Yeah.
It's-
So I think for them it's more longing and maybe longing for an unconnected life. I suspect actually. Yeah.
I think probably a common analogy when talking about the emulation versus simulation sort of thing, I always think of the difference between musical instruments and the actual music that comes to be played on them. And obviously, in 1600 we had entirely different style of music, but you think of the sheet music kind of as the software that continues to linger on while those instruments were stopped being made a certain way. And it wasn't really until the 20th century that people started thinking, maybe we can actually make a violin that is not only from that time, but it's made to replicate that time.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it took obviously a couple centuries for people to realize that might be kind of interesting, and rather than just playing it on our grand pianos instead of a harpsichord. Do you think there's any place for something like the hardware of these old computers in a couple centuries, someone's going to say, maybe we'll try to rebuild that so we can try and do it again rather than just emulate it on our current thing? Or is this just, I don't know, have you seen any interest in that direction?
I do actually. And you remind me, I watched this really fascinating documentary on synthesizers, and I think it's so odd that it's come to be pretty much widely accepted that certain analog synthesizers are just better than what we have nowadays, and so it's started up this little artisanal economy of people learning how to build them the way they were built in the 1960s, or even making them better than when they were made in the 1960s. But I don't know why people can't come to those exact same conclusions about computing. It's baffling, and that's what it makes me believe that just the ideology of technological progress is so powerful that we can barely think about that as an option. But there are people who are learning how to, 3D print parts that aren't going to be available for much longer. And I think people are trying to figure out how to make cathode ray tubes, right? Especially because of works by Nam June Paik, who, there are only so many still working cathode ray tube TVs around.
So
Isn't that the impetus behind the Raspberry Pi as well, which is modeled after the BBC microcomputers from the 80s? Like the whole idea was to not replicate the exact hardware, but get back to something that was cheap and could teach kids basically how to program.
Yes. What was the first part of your question? I didn't quite hear it before.
Oh no, I'm just saying, isn't that part of isn't that kind of the computing equivalent? I mean, it's kind of, it seems hard with computing because there's such an ideology of progress that, the idea of actually just let's go and rebuild the exact same thing that somebody made in the 80s, they might not be as, visible as like with synths, let's say.
Yeah.
But there is a kind of drive to go back to the first principles that were embodied in like earlier computers like the BBC Micro, for
I
instance.
think you're exactly right, yeah. And to get back to computing as a tool for education and creativity, yeah.
So in 300 years, we'll be able to 3D print an Apple II.
Probably. Probably 50.
There's a very mental jump to me between the creativity in the era when it was a single task, digital, but it was, you were going to type words into the computer versus the extreme noise and distraction of doing anything and doing things on the web, so I have the web in front of me, so I could go Twitter over here, and you're multitasking and you're that, hyper-connectedness versus back when you were programming or writing,
Yeah. I'm just speculating right now off the top of my head, but I wonder if there was a much more clear line in the 70s, not so much the 80s, between a work machine and a play machine. And so there wasn't that blurring of lines the way there is nowadays. There was the computer that you got to put in your living room or your kitchen when your kids played with it. And then there was the machine that was explicitly marketed to corporate guys, or more like their secretaries, I guess.
Well, in the early 70s, there were no home computers.
Yeah.
I mean, we used to fantasize about maybe someday you could buy a computer that was the size of a refrigerator and it would cost the price of a car, and you could have one at home.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah.
So, yeah. But people multitask too. I mean, you had, boom boxes and
But to a certain degree, because they got so cheap so fast, the Apple IIs there, made a rearguard action into the business world really fast. A lot of businesses suddenly, VisiCalc and Multiplan got in, oh, we don't care about computers, and suddenly, your secretary bringing in her little home computer and TV, and so it comes under the radar and from that direction.
I mean, it worked the other way too. Like I remember as a kid playing in the 80s, playing video games on all my friends' parents' computers, who had them for work for various reasons, Like you would go over there and be like, hey, we can get a game to run on it, so.
Yeah.
I mean, I wonder, the valences have changed, right? You would say like in the late 60s and early 70s, like people who had computers were using them for work and for play, especially at universities, right? You'd be sending emails and like whatever, and you'd also be writing code usually. And then I guess in the 80s there's more of a home computing kind of move, but especially with kids, the computers do both. And then I feel like, just, and this is just my own personal history maybe, but like I feel like it wasn't until the mid-90s that you got the real kind of like people are using the same computer to do everything kind of thing.
I think you might be right.
Can I just ask one quick thing about, we keep mentioning the 90s, or the 70s as a splitting point, and the 90s as this other splitting point, not just because of personal computer, but maybe World Wide Web, like multimedia on the web, things like that. But when Matthew Kirschenbaum asked you about the 90s, why not the 90s, was it just because of the absence in the book of that time period, or do you see something really particular happening in the 90s? Aside from the fact that we see all these other things emerging that were already emerged in some cases, like the BBS, but is there something about the sort of computing history or computing experience of the 90s that you think is particularly like worthy, maybe that's the wrong word, but sort of unique, and how would you describe that uniqueness?
I'm only going to repeat myself, though, that I really think that for me, the shape of computing was formed in the mid-'80s, and then it was only a logical extension of what had already happened in 1984, 1985 that continued in the 1990s. So that's why I think for me the most interesting experiments were happening on networks, because that was new. Even if networks had been around, I just think, especially artists and especially writers who tend to be, I think, a little slow to adopt new tech, that started to have a great appeal for them in the early to mid-90s. Yeah. think you were looking for another answer, but.
No,
that's
I'm
what I
just
thought.
thinking, I don't know, you made me think a lot of like Judith Donnett's work, like in the early 90s. I don't know if you're familiar with her, where she was kind of working with other artists and like art tech sort of people to kind of combat this commercial idea of what the network could do. And what you said about the that text could be read through as like a form of mediation, or to hear the noise within the network, or hear the process of mediation. I'm wondering how that would work, or if people have thought more about that with more mainstream uses of networks that we know that aren't so alternative, right? So I'm thinking about like, I think it was like a day in the life of cyberspace was one of her big projects, where she was trying to get people to have this sort of participatory culture online from all over the world to kind of, you know, all say what they were doing at any given moment, and then it was going to be tracked for 24 hours. So this idea of like time and the network and how fast you could communicate, but then also the messiness of that speed that people weren't totally able to sort of experience seamlessly.
Yeah.
So I don't know, that's more of a thought than a
I think you're
a question,
absolutely
but-
right, yeah. I guess I was just going for really obvious examples of friction,
Yeah.
but you're right, that's another good example. What's her last name? Judith, what's her last name?
Donnath, Donath. And I think I was thinking of her also because she showed me WebStalker. So
Oh, she did, great. Okay, I'll try to remember her name.
yeah.
You know, my own sense is that the 90s were kind of the time when people who did not consider themselves technical started really using computers.
Yeah.
Before then, you know, even with an Apple IIe, maybe somebody wanted to play games, but you know, you still kind of thought of yourself, I think, as a techie if you bought a computer
Yeah,
in the 80s.
that was definitely my experience. I didn't buy one until I think 94, 95, and it was
On the other hand, by the mid-90s, there really wasn't much of a users groups community thing like we had. And particularly, I was affiliated with some machines that got abandoned pretty early, the Texas Instruments people, and we would have, you would have users groups in bigger cities or conventions you would go to around these home computer levels. And I think by the 90s, the early pre-internet 90s, there was not as much of a community because everyone was running Windows 3.1 and doing, it was commodity and it was corporate.
They were huge Mac communities, though.
Yeah.
Right? And that was back when I think people felt that having a Mac actually meant to some sort of it sent some countercultural signal.
But I would say even then the strongest, Apple II and Mac communities were late 80s.
Mm-hmm.
And the community aspect of it waned there and came back to a certain degree with the internet connecting things. It's also, I was in kind of a backwater, some of these people that were in smaller towns, we had the BBS.
Mm-hmm.
There's only one, and we couldn't connect with people in other towns because it was $4 a minute, or whatever.
Yeah.
It was incredibly expensive.
Yeah. Were you going to ask a question?
Yes, I have a question. So you mentioned how the projects and experiments that you guys do at the lab, how you emphasize documentation and self-reflexivity and so on. So I wonder what is the process that you follow in terms of documentation, if you have any, and can I please borrow it?
That's such a great question, and unfortunately the answer is I don't really have a process.
I was thinking about, just to give a little bit more context, just thinking a little bit about along the lines of what the integrator is doing in the whole traversal kind of process, of having somebody that knows what's happening, do it and record it, and then have somebody else that doesn't know what they're doing do the same thing and kind of they come up with different kind of insights that way.
Well,
Sorry.
no, it's a fantastic question. I think part of my problem in answering it is that there's so many different little projects going on at the lab at the same time, being run by students or by artists or grad students, that I can't and I don't want to standardize the process in any way. But generally, what everybody does is just thoroughly document everything. So documenting processes is probably much more important than whatever it is they produce. And whatever that means for them is fine by me. Yeah. I guess all I'm saying is that I'm really against the production of shiny objects.
Yeah.
Beautiful things without any evidence of friction, I suppose. I keep using that word, but it's actually really important to me. I don't have a good answer.
No, that's perfectly good. Thanks.
A totally different question. Have you published your metadata schema, or do you have it available somewhere? I'm curious at what you put together.
It's on our lab website under the
Okay.
catalog, and the website unfortunately is broken right now. Sorry. It's part of living on a shoestring budget, that when something bad happens, it's really difficult to fix. But anyway, it is there and it should be up and running in a couple days. Otherwise, I can email it to you. Yeah.
Okay.
And could you maybe talk to us briefly about how the decisions you arrived at for making that schema, like what you decided was valuable versus other things to not document on that sort of level of granularity?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm trying to remember. It was a really fascinating process because a lot of it had to do with imagining users. And it's also strange to be in the situation of creating a metadata scheme, whereas most people just pick one and you just sort of passively use whatever is given to you. But I think the users we were imagining had strong materialist leanings, so we wanted to make sure that we gave people lots of information on memory and also cost, which is not included in most metadata schemes, like how much did it cost to buy that, where was it manufactured and by whom and for how long, and also inputs and outputs to try. So our users were both people who had a materialist bent and were interested in past technologies, but also people who were interested in maybe using it for some present use, and they would need to know how to add on to that machine in some way. Yeah, that's the best I can do.
So it focuses a lot on the physical description of the
Yeah.
equipment themselves.
Yes,
So,
exactly, yeah.
any provenance and information, how you got hold of it, or you know what it went through in its life cycle?
Oh, gosh. No. I would love to do that, but I would be working on this full time until the day I died if I did that. The best I can do is just have donor information. Yeah. There's something I was doing for a while, you can see it on my blog from a couple of years ago, is that I would have donors write up little narratives of their machines, and they would be delighted to do that, which in itself is really fascinating, how people have invested their personal histories in these machines, and they are actually very eager to share their life stories with me and how they intersected with the machine. But I just didn't have enough resources to keep going with that.
You consider it death and resurrection field for when the computer dies, and then when you find the right piece that makes it work again.
I guess I'm trying to do that.
How many times do you do that over time?
Yeah, that's right.
So you mentioned shoestring budgets. I'm kind of curious if you could maybe talk a little bit about that situation, and also kind of, I know from talking to some people who've tried to do similar things in terms of getting old computers, and equipment in a kind of academic setting, that there's a concern that will people actually use these, or is it worth kind of putting this effort into? So I'm wondering if you talk about you talked about the artist in residence and stuff. But so on the one hand, I'm wondering if you can talk about funding and how you sort of support it. And on the other hand, I'm wondering kind of like if you could talk a little bit about what kind of use cases there are for people coming in and using
Right.
equipment.
So I started the lab with a $20,000 startup grant. And the idea was that I was going to start a lab, but the person that gave me the money, I don't think had any idea it was going to be this lab. And then I did it, and he seemed fine with it. The wonderful thing about old computers is that they're cheap, so $20,000 actually goes a very, very long ways. I think it lasted me 5 years, maybe 4 or 5 years. And since then, I've had hardly any funding. And I have to admit, it made me bitter for a while, and now I think it's fantastic for a couple of reasons. One, it's made me more creative, and two, it's insisted on engagement from my students at all levels. So undergraduate students built the website, and a lot of them are volunteers, And they do it because they love it, but also I try to give back to them in terms of some sort of nifty title, like we'll tell them you're a curator. You can call yourself a curator, that's what you're doing. Or internships. I also have a research assistant once or maybe twice a year. Anyway, it's very, very modest, but I cobble it together mostly through people who are giving their time and their energy to the lab. But that's also why I try to make sure it's not hierarchical, because this is really a venture that wouldn't be possible without these other people. And I did manage to get a $25,000 donation from a venture capitalist, and I thought that was going to be the beginning of great things to come. And it turns out that that particular venture capitalist was just lovely and smart and thoughtful, and I haven't been able to repeat that success. I've had a lot of interactions with local startup companies, but it seems to be mostly in the vein of me doing something for them. So, you know, oh, our programmers are so tired, they've been coding all day, they want to play with your Atari 2600. Will you come and bring your machines to us? And then I do, but for what? You know, and I'm still teaching a full load and have to write books and do everything else. Use case scenarios. Yeah, so to get back to what I talked about at the beginning, I think it's actually worked out to my advantage to being in an English department and doing something that's a little bit odd and esoteric, because I've had nobody to report to. I do whatever I want, and the group of people that are affiliated with the lab do whatever we want. We don't really have to worry about justifying what we're doing to anybody. But as it happens, we do attract a lot of students from computer science, from film, from art and art history, and almost none from English, which is...
I mean, do people send their students to your lab for things? Like, do professors send their students to the lab for things, and if so, what kind of thing? Like, that's kind of more what I was curious about.
Yeah, they do. So there's HCI classes taught in computer science, and they send their students regularly over to us. People doing creative projects in film, but also we've got a technology arts media undergraduate program. They too come over to the lab a lot. I'm trying to think of who else. Also, actually, we're developing a relationship with the libraries, and when interns show up at the libraries, especially in special collections, they will come over. Maybe they'll even split their time between the MAL and the special collections. Yeah.
I think we're out of time, unless there's some questions that cannot wait. No? Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody.